Most gardens don't stop thriving all at once. In many cases, they slowly become harder to understand. A tomato that once grew effortlessly now struggles halfway through the season. Soil that used to stay balanced suddenly dries too fast or stays wet too long. And after a while, many gardeners begin wondering if they're doing something wrong. From my experience, this can be one of the most frustrating parts of gardening as the years go by. Because often you're still following advice that truly worked before. You're watering the same way, feeding the soil the same way, pruning the same way. But somehow the garden doesn't respond like it used to. And honestly, I don't think this conversation happens enough. A lot of gardening advice was shaped under different conditions. Cooler summers, less extreme weather swings, healthier starting soil, slower gardening routines. And over time, many small changes began stacking on top of each other without most of us fully noticing. This doesn't mean old gardening wisdom is useless. Far from it. Some of the best lessons in gardening still come from experience passed down over decades. But what worked reliably 20 years ago may now need a little more observation, a little more flexibility, and sometimes a slower approach than we're used to hearing online. In this video, we're going to look at a few gardening habits that once made perfect sense, but may no longer work quite the same way today. Not to shame anyone, not to debunk the past, but simply to understand what our gardens might be asking from us now. And if you've ever felt confused by a garden that suddenly became harder to manage, you're definitely not alone. One of the hardest things about gardening is that problems rarely announce themselves clearly. A plant doesn't usually tell you, the soil structure is changing, or the roots are struggling below the surface. Most of the time, the garden simply becomes a little less responsive each season, until eventually you start questioning yourself. And honestly, I think many experienced gardeners carry more frustration than they admit. Because when something that worked reliably for years suddenly stops working, the first instinct is often self-blame. Maybe I watered too much. Maybe I waited too long. Maybe I forgot something important. But from what I've seen, that's not always the real story. In many home gardens, the conditions themselves have changed quietly over time. Summers stay hotter later into the evening. Heavy rain comes all at once instead of spreading across the week. Soil in raised beds ages differently than it did when the bed was first built. Even the pace of gardening advice online has changed how people interact with their gardens. Years ago, many gardening routines developed around slower rhythms. People observed longer before reacting. Seasons felt more predictable. Soil had more time to stabilize between corrections. Today, a lot of gardeners feel pressure to constantly adjust something. Add fertilizer, trim more growth, fix yellow leaves immediately, switch watering schedules every few days. And the difficult part is, some of those actions really can help in the short term. That's what makes this confusing. A quick correction may improve appearance for a week or two, while slowly creating more imbalance underneath. I've noticed that many struggling gardens are not failing because the gardener stopped caring. Sometimes they struggle because the gardener cares deeply and keeps trying to help faster than the garden can recover. That doesn't mean you should stop gardening carefully. It simply means the old relationship between effort and results is no longer as predictable as it once felt. And once you begin seeing that pattern, a lot of confusing garden problems start making a little more sense. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings in modern gardening is the idea that older advice suddenly became wrong. In most cases, that's not really what happened. A lot of those methods worked because they were built around conditions that felt more stable and predictable than what many gardeners are dealing with now. Years ago, many home gardens experienced slower seasonal swings. Spring warmed gradually. Rain patterns were often more consistent. Summer evenings cooled down more reliably. Soil moisture had more time to balance itself naturally between watering cycles. And when conditions are more stable, gardening routines tend to feel more forgiving. A watering habit that worked beautifully 15 years ago may now leave the soil too wet for too long during humid stretches, or not nearly deep enough during sudden heat waves. The routine itself may not be terrible. The environment around that routine simply changed. I've also noticed that older gardens often behave differently because the soil had not yet accumulated years of correction after correction. fewer fertilizers layered on top of each other, less repeated disturbance, fewer emergency fixes. In many cases, the garden ecosystem was simply under less pressure. Today, a lot of gardeners are trying to manage conditions that fluctuate much faster than they used to. One week feels cool and mild, the next suddenly feels dry and exhausting. And when the garden changes quickly, people naturally react more quickly too. The difficult part is that constant adjustment can slowly train us to stop observing carefully. We begin reacting to symptoms instead of patterns. Yellow leaf? Add fertilizer. Dry surface? Add water. Slow growth? Change something immediately. But gardens are rarely that simple. Sometimes a stressed plant needs less interference, not more. Sometimes soil needs stability before it can regain balance. And sometimes the smartest adjustment is simply slowing down long enough to notice what's actually changing underneath the surface. From my experience, many older gardening principles still hold real value today, but they often work best when combined with observation instead of routine alone. And honestly, I think that shift, from automatic habits to careful observation, may become one of the most important gardening skills moving forward. One reason soil exhaustion becomes so difficult to recognize is that it rarely begins with dramatic failure. Most gardens don't suddenly collapse. More often, the soil simply loses resilience little by little until the whole system starts feeling harder to manage. A plant may still grow. Leaves may still look mostly green. You may even harvest decent vegetables for a while. But underneath the surface, the soil slowly becomes less balanced, less breathable, and less biologically active than it once was. And because the changes happen gradually, many gardeners adapt to the decline without fully realizing it. In raised beds especially, this can happen faster than people expect. Organic matter breaks down year after year. Water moves differently through older soil layers. Fine particles settle lower and create compaction zones. Sometimes the top few inches still look healthy, while deeper areas remain heavy and stressed. I've noticed that many gardeners respond to this by adding more and more inputs. More compost, more fertilizer, more amendments. And occasionally those additions help temporarily. But if the underlying structure of the soil is struggling, extra inputs alone may not restore long-term balance. Healthy soil is not just rich soil, it's active soil. Soil that drains properly while still holding moisture. Soil that allows oxygen to move downward. Soil where roots can expand without constantly fighting compaction or instability. One subtle sign of soil exhaustion is when plants stop responding normally to care that once worked well. Watering feels inconsistent. Growth becomes uneven. Some plants stall, while others nearby seem mostly fine. The garden begins behaving less like a connected system and more like isolated patches of stress. Another sign is when gardeners feel they need to intervene constantly just to maintain average results. If every small issue immediately demands correction, the soil may no longer be buffering stress the way healthy soil naturally can. From my experience, exhausted soil often asks for slower recovery than people expect. Not dramatic resets, not tearing everything out. Usually, it responds better to consistency, reduced disturbance, gradual organic rebuilding, and time. And honestly, I think this is where many gardeners become too hard on themselves. Because soil recovery rarely looks exciting week to week. But over longer periods, small, stable improvements often matter far more than aggressive fixes. One thing I've noticed over the years is that many gardens don't become difficult because of one major mistake. More often, they become difficult through accumulation. Small imbalances, repeated stress, tiny corrections layered on top of older corrections until the garden slowly loses its natural rhythm. And the hard part is, most of these changes look harmless at first. A little extra fertilizer because growth slowed down, a little more watering during a hot week, a quick pruning session to help the plant recover. None of these actions sound unreasonable by themselves. But gardens remember patterns, even when we don't. Soil remembers repeated compaction. Roots remember unstable moisture cycles. Plants remember constant interruption during growth. And over long enough periods, the entire garden ecosystem can start reacting differently to care that once felt completely normal. I think this is why older gardens sometimes feel strangely exhausting to maintain. Not because the gardener suddenly lost skill, but because the system underneath has become less resilient after years of accumulated pressure. In many home gardens, there's also a gradual shift toward management mode. Instead of observing and guiding the garden, people slowly begin controlling every symptom as it appears. A yellow leaf becomes an emergency. A dry patch must be fixed immediately. Slower growth feels like failure instead of variation. And unfortunately, constant correction often creates more instability than the original problem did. I've seen gardens where the soil never has time to settle because something is always being added, removed, adjusted, watered, trimmed, or repaired. The garden stays active, but never fully stable. Healthy ecosystems usually depend on recovery periods. Forests recover slowly. Soil biology rebuilds slowly. Root systems stabilize slowly. But modern gardening culture sometimes makes people feel uncomfortable with slow improvement. We're surrounded by fast results now. Instant fixes, quick transformations, constant optimization. And after a while, it becomes difficult to trust gradual progress anymore. But from my experience, many struggling gardens don't need more intensity. They need fewer disruptions, more consistency, more observation, and enough time for natural balance to return little by little. Sometimes the garden isn't asking us to work harder. Sometimes it's asking us to stop interrupting the recovery process. Watering used to feel much more predictable for many gardeners. You learned a rhythm that worked for your climate, your soil, and your plants. And in many seasons, that rhythm stayed fairly reliable year after year. But one thing I've noticed recently is that soil no longer behaves as consistently as many older watering routines expect it to. Some gardens dry out faster on the surface while staying damp underneath. Others hold moisture too long after sudden heavy rain, especially in raised beds and containers that have aged over time. And this creates a very confusing situation for gardeners. The soil looks dry, the leaves droop slightly, the weather feels hot, so naturally we water more. But sometimes the deeper root zone is already struggling with too much moisture, even while the top layer appears thirsty. That mismatch can slowly weaken root behavior over time. Years ago, many soils had more stable structure and slower evaporation patterns. Organic matter was fresher, compaction was lower, seasonal weather swings were often less aggressive. A watering schedule could stay effective for long periods without requiring constant adjustment. Today, conditions can shift extremely fast. A cool morning becomes intense heat by afternoon. One heavy storm saturates the soil for days. Mulch breaks down differently than it used to. Raised beds heat up faster. Containers lose balance faster. And unfortunately, many gardeners respond by watering based on surface appearance alone. But surface dryness doesn't always tell the full story anymore. I've seen soil look dusty and dry on top while remaining cold, dense, and oxygen-poor deeper below. In situations like that, adding more water can sometimes increase stress instead of relieving it. One subtle sign this is happening is when plants appear both dry and overwatered at the same time. Leaves droop, growth slows, but the soil never seems to fully stabilize no matter how often watering changes. Healthy watering today often requires more observation than routine, not because older routines were foolish, but because the soil conditions underneath those routines may no longer behave the same way they once did. From my experience, one of the most helpful changes many gardeners can make is learning to pause before reacting to surface dryness alone. Sometimes the garden is asking for water, and sometimes it's asking for air. Very few gardeners overwater because they don't care. In fact, overwatering usually begins from the opposite place: concern, attention, the desire to help a struggling plant recover before things get worse. A leaf droops slightly during heat. The soil surface feels dry by afternoon. Growth slows more than expected. And naturally, many people respond by giving the garden more water, because watering feels productive, immediate, reassuring. But plants don't only respond to water itself. They also respond to oxygen, root stability, microbial balance, and the natural wet-dry rhythm inside healthy soil. When soil stays consistently saturated for too long, roots often stop expanding normally. Instead of searching deeper for moisture and oxygen, they remain closer to the surface where conditions fluctuate more quickly. Over time, this can create plants that appear increasingly dependent on constant watering. And what makes this especially confusing is that overwatered plants often resemble underwatered plants. Leaves droop, growth slows, edges dry out. Gardeners see stress and add even more water trying to solve it. I think many experienced gardeners have gone through this cycle at least once without fully realizing it at the time. In raised beds and containers, the problem can become even harder to judge accurately. Surface soil dries quickly under sun and wind, while deeper layers may stay heavy and oxygen poor for days longer than expected. I've seen gardeners water repeatedly because the top inch looked dry, while the lower root zone never truly had a chance to breathe again. Healthy roots usually need movement between moisture and air. Soil that never partially dries can slowly lose the structure and biological activity that help roots stay resilient over long periods. This doesn't mean gardens should become dry or neglected. Consistent stress from drought creates its own problems too. But healthy watering often depends less on frequency alone and more on understanding how your specific soil now holds and releases moisture. From my experience, one of the most useful habits is learning to observe deeper signs before reacting quickly. Soil temperature, weight, smell, root depth, morning recovery. These small observations often tell a more accurate story than the surface alone. Sometimes watering more feels like helping, but sometimes patience and oxygen help the garden recover far more gently. Fertilizer is one of those gardening tools that can feel very reassuring when plants begin struggling. Growth slows down, leaves lose color, harvests become smaller. And adding nutrients feels like a logical response. And sometimes it truly does help. Nutrient deficiencies are real. Soil can absolutely become depleted over time. But one thing I've noticed is that fertilizer can also temporarily hide deeper structural problems underneath the surface. A plant may become greener after feeding. Leaves may expand faster. New growth may appear stronger for a short period. And naturally, this creates the feeling that the underlying issue has been solved. But healthy growth depends on much more than nutrient availability alone. Roots still need oxygen. Soil still needs stable structure. Water still needs to move properly through the root zone. Biological life in the soil still needs balance. I've seen gardens where fertilizer kept plants looking productive for quite a while, even as the soil itself slowly became harder, denser, and less resilient underneath. The garden looked active on the surface, but the foundation was quietly weakening over time. In some situations, frequent feeding can even encourage plants to stay shallow-rooted. When nutrients and moisture are constantly available near the surface, roots may stop exploring deeper soil layers as aggressively as they once did. And this is where many gardeners accidentally enter a difficult cycle. Growth slows, so more fertilizer gets added. The plant responds temporarily, so the routine repeats. But the deeper imbalance underneath never fully stabilizes. I think this is one reason older raised beds and containers sometimes become surprisingly difficult after years of heavy feeding. Salts build gradually. Soil texture changes. Microbial diversity narrows. Moisture movement becomes less predictable. None of these changes happen overnight. But over enough seasons, the garden begins requiring more effort just to maintain the same average results. Healthy soil usually behaves more like a living system than a feeding schedule. Compost, organic matter, airflow, moisture cycles, root activity, and biological diversity all interact together slowly over time. From my experience, fertilizer works best when it supports an already functioning soil system, not when it's constantly trying to compensate for exhaustion underneath. Sometimes the goal is not to feed the plant harder. Sometimes the goal is helping the soil become alive and stable again. I think one of the quietest problems in modern gardening is that many gardens no longer get enough time to simply settle. Something always needs adjusting. More water, more fertilizer, different mulch, new pruning method, a new product someone recommended online. And after a while, the garden never fully rests between corrections. Most gardeners don't do this because they're careless. Usually it comes from attention and effort. People genuinely want to help their plants thrive. But over time, constant intervention can slowly create an environment where the garden loses stability faster than it can recover. Healthy ecosystems tend to depend on rhythm, wet and dry cycles, root expansion and rest, organic matter slowly breaking down, soil organisms rebuilding naturally after disturbance. These processes rarely happen quickly, but modern gardening culture often rewards activity more than observation. If growth slows, do something. If leaves change color, fix it immediately. If the soil looks different, replace something. The pressure to react quickly is everywhere now. And honestly, I think this creates exhaustion not only for the garden, but for the gardener too. I've seen people spend entire seasons chasing symptoms from one bed to another, constantly trying new fixes, while never giving the underlying system enough consistency to stabilize again. In some gardens, the soil becomes so frequently disturbed that roots stop adapting deeply. Microbial life struggles to recover between changes, moisture patterns become irregular, and eventually, even small problems start triggering larger stress responses across the garden. One thing that surprised me over the years is how often plants improve after fewer interventions instead of more. Not neglect, not ignoring real issues, but reducing unnecessary corrections long enough for the garden to regain rhythm naturally. Sometimes gardeners accidentally train themselves to distrust slow recovery. If improvement isn't visible within days, another adjustment gets added. But living systems usually move at a different pace than human impatience. Compost takes time. Roots take time, soil biology takes time, even healthy watering cycles take time to rebalance. From my experience, some of the healthiest gardens are not the ones being constantly optimized. They're the ones where the gardener learned when to step in and when to step back. And honestly, that balance may be one of the hardest gardening skills to learn today. Raised beds and containers can be wonderful gardening tools. They warm up faster in spring, offer better accessibility, improve drainage in difficult areas, and make small space gardening much more manageable. But one thing I think many gardeners underestimate is how differently these systems age compared to in-ground soil. At first, a new raised bed often feels incredibly productive. Fresh organic matter, loose soil, excellent drainage, fast root growth. Plants respond quickly and enthusiastically, and for several seasons, the entire system may seem easier to manage than traditional garden beds. But over time, the internal structure begins changing in ways that are easy to miss. Organic matter gradually breaks down. Fine particles settle downward. Moisture movement becomes less even. Compaction slowly develops in lower layers where roots and water repeatedly concentrate. And because the top few inches may still look healthy, many gardeners don't immediately realize the deeper root zone is behaving very differently than it did in the beginning. I've seen raised beds where the surface stayed soft and productive, while the lower layers became dense, oxygen poor, and increasingly difficult for roots to move through naturally. Containers often age even faster. Their soil volume is smaller. Temperature swings happen more aggressively. Moisture cycles become sharper. Salts from fertilizers accumulate more quickly. Biological diversity narrows more easily. And after enough seasons, container soil can begin feeling strangely unstable, drying too fast one week and staying wet too long the next. What makes this especially confusing is that many gardeners respond to aging soil systems by increasing inputs instead of rebuilding structure. More fertilizer, more watering, more products, more quick adjustments. But if the physical and biological structure underneath has become exhausted, those additions may only create short-term improvement. Ground soil often has advantages that raised systems struggle to replicate long-term. Larger biological networks, more temperature stability, deeper moisture buffering, slower structural shifts. Nature has more room to rebalance itself gradually underground. That doesn't mean raised beds or containers are bad choices. Far from it. They can remain incredibly productive for many years, but they usually need more intentional rebuilding over time than many gardeners expect when first starting them. From my experience, older raised beds often respond best to slower restoration rather than aggressive correction. Fresh organic matter, reduced compaction, gentle moisture management, periods of stability. Sometimes maintaining productivity long-term is less about constantly feeding the system and more about helping the system breathe and recover again. One thing that has changed dramatically in recent years is how quickly gardening advice now spreads. Every week there's a new method, a new product, a new must-do technique promising healthier soil, faster growth, or bigger harvests. And to be fair, some of these ideas are genuinely useful. Gardening continues evolving, and many people share thoughtful experience online. But I also think modern gardening culture sometimes creates the feeling that a healthy garden should always be actively optimized. More amendments, more pruning, more feeding schedules, more companion planting systems, more constant tweaking. And after a while, the garden can begin feeling less like a living ecosystem and more like a project under permanent correction. I've noticed that many older gardeners often grew healthier gardens partly because they interfered less. Not because they knew less, but because the pace of gardening naturally forced more patience, observation, and seasonal rhythm. There were fewer products, fewer instant fixes, fewer voices demanding immediate action. Today, many gardeners consume more advice in a single week than people once encountered over entire seasons. And while information itself isn't the problem, constant exposure to better methods can quietly create dissatisfaction with stable routines that were already working reasonably well. A garden may be healthy, but not optimized. Productive, but not perfect. Balanced, but not visually impressive online. And sometimes that's completely fine. I think one hidden cost of modern gardening advice is that it can slowly disconnect people from observing their own specific environment. Instead of learning how their soil behaves, their weather, their microclimate, many gardeners begin chasing generalized solutions designed for completely different conditions. I've seen people replace perfectly stable routines simply because a new technique sounded more advanced or more efficient online. But healthy gardens often rely on consistency more than novelty. Soil organisms adapt to patterns. Roots adapt to watering rhythms. Plants adapt to seasonal expectations. Constantly replacing systems can interrupt that quiet adaptation process over and over again. This doesn't mean gardeners should stop learning. Curiosity is valuable. Experimentation can absolutely improve a garden. But I think long-term stability usually comes from adding new ideas slowly enough that the ecosystem underneath still has time to respond naturally. From my experience, one of the healthiest things a gardener can sometimes say is, "This system may not be perfect, but it's stable." And honestly, stability is often far more valuable than endless optimization. One thing gardening slowly teaches over time is that plants are often far more tolerant of imperfection than constant instability. A garden does not need perfect conditions every day to remain healthy, but it usually does need some degree of consistency. I think many gardeners become exhausted trying to create ideal conditions all the time, perfect watering, perfect feeding, perfect timing, perfect pest control. And when the garden inevitably shifts outside that control, it can feel like failure instead of normal variation. But healthy ecosystems are rarely perfectly controlled. Natural systems fluctuate constantly. Temperatures change, rainfall changes, growth rates shift throughout the season. Even healthy soil moves through periods of stress and recovery. What often matters more is whether the overall system remains stable enough for roots, microbes, moisture, and plant growth to adapt gradually together. I've noticed that many plants handle mild imperfections surprisingly well when conditions stay relatively predictable. Slightly uneven moisture, minor nutrient variation, a cooler week, a hotter week. Most established gardens can usually absorb those changes without major damage. What becomes harder for plants is repeated disruption. One week extremely wet, the next week bone dry, constant pruning, frequent fertilizer changes, repeated soil disturbance. Roots rarely get enough time to fully adapt before conditions shift again. And over time, this creates a subtle kind of stress that many gardeners mistake for weakness in the plant itself. But sometimes the plant isn't weak at all. Sometimes it's simply trying to survive inside an environment that never fully stabilizes. I think this is especially important in older gardens where soil systems have already lost some resilience over the years. The less stable the foundation becomes, the more valuable consistency tends to become. Not perfection, not endless correction, just steadier rhythms. One thing that surprised me over the years is how often gardens quietly improve after routines become simpler. Watering at more consistent depths, disturbing the soil less often, allowing mulch to break down naturally, reducing unnecessary feeding, observing longer before reacting. None of these changes feel dramatic, but together, they often create calmer conditions that plants respond to surprisingly well. Modern gardening culture sometimes makes stability seem boring because it doesn't produce instant transformation. But living systems usually trust slow patterns more than dramatic intervention. From my experience, many struggling gardens do not need perfection to recover. They simply need conditions calm enough to rebuild resilience again. And sometimes the healthiest thing a gardener can offer is not more control, but a more stable environment to grow in. I think many experienced gardeners eventually arrive at a quiet realization. A garden can keep producing for quite a long time, even while slowly losing resilience underneath. And because the decline happens gradually, the warning signs are easy to normalize. A tomato season that feels slightly weaker than last year, beds that dry unevenly, plants that recover more slowly after heat, soil that feels heavier after rain, roots that stay shallower than they once did. None of these changes seem dramatic by themselves, but over enough seasons, small signals begin forming a larger pattern. I've noticed that many long-term gardeners don't recognize the shift until maintenance itself starts feeling unusually tiring. The garden needs more feeding to get the same growth, more watering to prevent stress, more correction to keep plants stable, more effort just to maintain average results. And often, that's when people begin wondering what changed. Sometimes the answer is not one major mistake. Sometimes it's simply years of accumulated imbalance quietly reducing the garden's ability to buffer stress naturally. Healthy soil usually absorbs small fluctuations gracefully. Exhausted systems often react sharply to even minor pressure. One thing that surprised me over time is how often gardeners blame themselves for problems that are actually structural. They assume they stopped paying attention, stopped working hard enough, forgot some important technique. But in many cases, the garden itself has simply become less resilient after years of disturbance, compaction, inconsistent moisture cycles, or biological decline. I think another reason this realization comes late is because modern gardening culture often focuses more on visible growth than invisible stability. If the harvest still looks acceptable, deeper exhaustion can remain hidden for a long time. Leaves may still grow, flowers may still bloom, but underneath, the ecosystem may already be operating under constant strain. Experienced gardeners often sense this emotionally before they fully understand it technically. The garden stops feeling calm. Small problems spread faster. Recovery takes longer. Everything feels slightly more fragile than it used to. And honestly, I think that intuition matters. Because long before soil tests or visible failure, many gardeners quietly notice when the rhythm of the garden no longer feels balanced. From my experience, recognizing these patterns is not a sign of failure. It's actually the beginning of deeper understanding. A garden that becomes harder to manage is not always asking for more control. Sometimes it's simply revealing years of quiet exhaustion that finally need time, stability, and recovery. One thing I've learned over time is that struggling gardens rarely recover through one dramatic change. Recovery usually happens through smaller adjustments that reduce stress little by little while allowing the system underneath to stabilize again. And honestly, many of the most helpful changes are surprisingly simple. Not exciting, not trendy, not instant, but often much gentler on the soil, roots, and long-term balance of the garden. One adjustment that helps many older gardens is reducing unnecessary disturbance. Less digging, less turning the soil, less constant root interruption. Healthy soil structure usually rebuilds more effectively when it's allowed to settle gradually over time. Another helpful shift is watering more deeply but less reactively. Instead of responding to every dry-looking surface immediately, many gardeners benefit from observing deeper moisture first. Slower watering cycles often encourage roots to move downward again, instead of remaining trapped near the surface. I've also noticed that older raised beds often respond well to slower organic rebuilding instead of aggressive feeding. Fresh compost added gradually, mulch allowed to decompose naturally, small biological improvements repeated consistently over seasons. These changes rarely create dramatic short-term transformation, but over longer periods, they can quietly rebuild resilience underneath. Sometimes simplifying routines helps more than adding new techniques. Using fewer products, changing fewer variables at once, giving the garden time to respond before making another correction. I think many gardens become healthier simply because the ecosystem finally has enough stability to adapt again. One thing that surprised me over the years is how often recovery begins after gardeners stop trying to force visible improvement every single week. Soil biology moves slowly. Roots rebuild slowly. Moisture balance stabilizes slowly. And once we stop interrupting those processes constantly, the garden often begins recovering in quieter ways first. The early signs of recovery are usually subtle. Soil feels softer after watering. Plants recover faster in the morning. Mulch breaks down more evenly. Growth becomes slightly more consistent. These changes may not look impressive online, but they often signal that the system underneath is becoming healthier again. I think one of the hardest parts of long-term gardening is learning to trust gradual improvement enough to stay patient with it. Especially today, when so much advice focuses on visible transformation instead of invisible recovery. From my experience, gardens often heal more sustainably when recovery happens at the speed the ecosystem can realistically support. Not the speed of frustration, not the speed of social media, the speed of biology. And honestly, sometimes the smallest, steady adjustments end up changing the garden more deeply than the biggest corrections ever could. One thing I've come to respect deeply about gardening is that the garden rarely hides the truth forever. It may delay it, it may soften it, it may reveal it slowly over several seasons, but eventually, the condition of the soil, roots, moisture balance, and overall ecosystem begins showing itself through patterns that are difficult to ignore. I think this is why experienced gardeners often become more patient over time, not because they stop caring, but because they realize that quick reactions can sometimes interrupt information the garden is quietly trying to reveal. A stressed plant may not always mean a nutrient deficiency. Slow growth may not always mean the garden needs more fertilizer. Dry surface soil may not always mean deeper roots need more water. Sometimes the garden is communicating something more structural underneath. I've noticed that healthier, long-term gardening often begins when people stop asking only, "How do I fix this quickly?" and start asking, "What pattern keeps returning here?" That shift changes everything. Instead of chasing isolated symptoms, gardeners begin observing relationships: how moisture moves after rain, how roots respond to repeated watering, how soil texture changes over seasons, how certain beds recover faster than others, how the garden behaves during stress, not just during ideal conditions. And over time, those observations usually become far more valuable than any single product or technique. One thing modern gardening culture sometimes forgets is that living systems communicate gradually. Soil exhaustion develops gradually. Biological recovery happens gradually. Resilience returns gradually. When we expect instant visible transformation, we often miss the quieter signals that actually matter most. I think this is why some gardeners eventually move away from constant optimization and become much more focused on stability, rhythm, and observation. Not because they stopped learning, but because they learned that healthy ecosystems rarely respond well to endless pressure and interruption. The garden usually rewards consistency more than intensity. Steady organic matter, steady moisture cycles, steady observation, steady patience. None of those things feel dramatic week to week, but over years they quietly shape the entire resilience of the system. And honestly, I think this may be one of the hardest lessons in gardening today, because modern life trains us to expect fast, visible results almost everywhere else. But gardens still operate on biological time. From my experience, some of the healthiest gardens are not the ones that look perfect every season. They're the ones that slowly become more stable, more resilient, and easier to care for over many years. And usually, that kind of health is built quietly, patiently, and almost invisibly at first. I think one of the most comforting realizations in gardening is understanding that healthy gardens are rarely created through constant perfection. Most long-lasting gardens are built slowly, quietly, season after season. Not because everything always goes right, but because the system underneath gradually becomes stable enough to absorb stress without collapsing every time conditions change. And honestly, I think many gardeners underestimate how valuable that kind of resilience really is. A garden that survives heat better, recovers from rain more calmly, needs fewer emergency corrections, feels easier to care for year after year. Those qualities usually come from long-term balance more than short-term intensity. I've noticed that the healthiest older gardens often share a similar feeling. The soil feels alive. Moisture behaves more predictably. Plants recover faster after stress. The entire ecosystem feels calmer somehow. Not perfect, not flawless, just stable enough that life underneath can keep rebuilding itself naturally. And in many cases, that stability was not created by doing more and more every season. It was created by learning when to stop interfering unnecessarily, allowing roots to deepen again, allowing soil structure to recover, allowing biological systems time to rebalance slowly. I think modern gardening culture sometimes makes people feel like they should always be improving something immediately. But living systems usually do not respond best under constant pressure. Forests recover slowly. Healthy soil forms slowly. Even resilient ecosystems often require long, quiet periods between stress and recovery. Gardens are not machines. They are living relationships between soil, water, roots, weather, biology, and time. And because of that, long-term health often depends less on controlling every variable and more on supporting conditions that allow natural resilience to return gradually. One thing I've learned over the years is that many struggling gardens are not asking for more intensity. They are asking for calmer rhythms, more patience, more observation, more consistency, and sometimes simply fewer interruptions. I also think gardeners deserve more grace than modern culture often allows, because a garden becoming difficult does not automatically mean the gardener failed. Sometimes it simply means the ecosystem underneath has been carrying stress quietly for a very long time. And recognizing that truth is often the beginning of healthier decisions moving forward. From my experience, the goal of gardening is not creating a perfect garden that never struggles. The goal is creating a living system resilient enough to keep recovering, season after season, year after year. And usually, that kind of resilience is built through small, steady care that almost nobody notices at first. Thank you for spending this time in the garden with me. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more quiet, practical gardening insights. I'll see you again in the next one.